Constantinople. No, you can't go back to Constantinople. Been a long time gone. Constantinople, why did Constantinople get the works? That's nobody's business but the Turks.
Hello everybody and welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking about Constantinople, and this is actually present day Istanbul, and I think the name was changed in 1930, but Constantinople was once the capital of the Roman Byzantine Empire, at least according to the official narrative. And we're going to be looking at Constantinople from an alternative history perspective. Now, our first stop, I wanted to talk about this harbor of Theodosius, which we are told was created or established in the 4th century AD. Now, this is a recreation as well that you're looking at, but this, where my mouse is, this is a recreation of this harbor of Theodosius. Now, what's of interest to us with regards to this harbor is that it no longer exists and is silted up. Now, on Google Earth, if you look up where this port is, it's now inland. I think it's like a little less than 2 kilometers inland. So the coastline has changed. But when you start digging into the history of this harbor, we are told that silt from this creek eventually filled the harbor entirely. Now, they were upgrading their mass transit system, and they started doing excavations in this area, and they uncovered this harbor, this ancient harbor, and they started finding some interesting things. And this is just sort of on the left here, this is sort of the excavation area. And they started, as soon as they got down to about 4 feet, they started finding artifacts. And I know they've gone well below 30 feet. On the right, you can kind of see some of the excavations that they've done. And I think it was over the course of like 9 years. And the excavation site extends over 58,000 square meters and about 10 city blocks. So just a massive undertaking. I think it was like 9 years in duration. They uncovered like 25,000 artifacts, found old, city walls, seawalls, and a lot of skeletal remains as well. And I think you've got, these are just the number of identified species, but you can just see the numbers of these skeletons that they found, and all kinds of camels, deer, dolphin, I might have said that, but just all sorts of skeletons that they've found as well. And I think this is a camel that had its neck sort of bent backwards. So they believe that there was a tsunami of some sorts at the end of the 10th or early 11th century. When they were excavating, they also found 37 Byzantine ships that were told date from the 7th to the 11th century. So they're basically saying here that there's 2 separate events. You had this silting up of the harbor, which occurred over time, and then you had this tsunami as well in the 10th or 11th century that caused the deaths of all these animals and sunk these ships. So they're looking at it, what happened here is 2 separate events, but I think this is all part of this one disastrous worldwide event that I've touched on in previous videos, such as Scorched Earth, the video called Scorched Earth. But there's another person that I featured in the video called The Timeline Manipulation, Gunnar Heinzen, and he talks about this particular harbor of Theodosius, and he just talks about how they find these shattered ceramics, which are dated to the 4th century. They're mixed with ceramics, which are also dated to the 8th and 9th centuries, as well as some of these ships. And archaeologists cannot understand how pots and ships distant in time by 500 to 600 years can be shattered together. So within this port, they've found all these shipwrecks are typically, I think they're almost all in one location, the eastern part of the port. But they've got all these ceramics on them, and it appears like they've all suffered the same fate at the same time, but they're dated to like 500-600 years apart. Some of the boats, some of the ceramics. So I think it was one event, and this is just, I think, a good example of how they've introduced the phantom years. This is sort of where I think it breaks down their narrative. Yeah, so I don't think we're looking at two events with regards to this, what happened to this harbor. I think it was one event that caused the loss of life to the animals and caused all these shipwrecks to happen, and all this happened at one time, as opposed to spread out over whatever they say, 600-700 years. But if that's the case, then we should be able to find, if there was some mega event, then we should be able to find some other traces of that in Constantinople and other locations. So with that in mind, let's take a look at this hippodrome. Now, when you look at the hippodrome, which has been renamed here, or what's left of it has been renamed, but the location of where the hippodrome used to be and this excavation site where this harbor was, we're talking less than 1.5 miles. So whatever happened here probably should have been experienced here too. So when you start looking at the hippodrome and 16th century engraving, and again, I don't know how much reliance we can put on engravings, but it's interesting nonetheless. They seem to be indicating it's in a state of disrepair at the very least. And just for reference here, kind of showing you what it might have looked like in the past. But so you got these interesting engravings, and in 1922 you've got the hippodrome here, or at least the top of it, what we can see, and the Hagia Sophia in the background. But when you start digging into excavations in this area, you find, like in the 1950s, they're uncovering stadium steps completely buried. And when you dig a little further, you find other underground remains of the hippodrome. I believe there is a museum of Turkish and Islamic arts, which is right next to the hippodrome. And during restoration work of the museum's ground floor, they discovered vaulted structures that once belonged to the tiers of the west side of the hippodrome. So they're finding underneath the main floor parts of the hippodrome. Now, in addition to that, there was this great palace of Constantinople, which was attached to the hippodrome. Now, according to the narrative, Constantine I rebuilt the hippodrome. He enlarged it and connected it to the great palace. But today, only a few remnants and fragments of its foundations have survived. But these fragments of its foundations, they lie underneath the present-day Blue Mosque. So in the bottom right here, the Blue Mosque, this sits on top of this great palace. So what we have present day is this great palace underneath. It's underground, and most of the hippodrome is underneath the present ground level. And I think the reason why the harbor that we looked at is underneath the current ground level, and this palace and the hippodrome, why they're all beneath the ground level, the present day grade, is because of this major event which happened at one time, and it just created all this devastation, and people just built on top of that. After the fact. So I think that's what's going on here. And I think it's the same event that buried a lot of these Roman baths that we see in England, and as well as in Amman, Jordan, and in Spain, I believe. So, and as well as all of the accumulation of sediment in Rome during all those excavations. And I think we're looking at a singular event, but we are given, just in my view, cover story after cover story to explain it away. Because if you look up like what caused the hippodrome to be destroyed, they'll piece together a whole narrative. I don't agree with it, but there is definitely a narrative associated with that. And there's explanations given for all these things, but I think we're looking at one event, in my view. So now let's take a look at these mosaics that are tied to Constantinople and the Fourth Crusade. Now the next thing I want to touch on are mosaics, because there are some interesting mosaics that I believe relate to Constantinople. And it's these mosaics of San Giovanni Evangelista Church, and it's in Ravenna, Italy, I believe. But just for a quick refresher, the Fourth Crusade, which is what's represented in these mosaics, the Fourth Crusade was basically the sack of Constantinople, which occurred in April of 1204 and marked the culmination of the Fourth Crusade. Crusader armies captured, looted, and destroyed parts of Constantinople, which was then the capital of the Byzantine Empire. So going into looking at these mosaics, I had my doubts already because of just looking into Constantinople. I believe it was destroyed by this huge catastrophe, which isn't in the history book. So I'm looking at these mosaics already with skepticism. But before we go into looking at them specifically, this particular church in 1927, we're told built, I believe it was like the 5th century. Over here, it was built in the 5th century AD. And these mosaics were installed in, I think, like 1213 AD, we're told. And then in the 1700s, this church was renovated. And I think in like 1760, these mosaics were placed on the walls. But in 1944, there was an Allied bombing, which destroyed most of the church, as you can see. But luckily, fragments of those mosaics were found underneath the bombs that belonged to this the 13th century. These mosaics survived this bombing, which is interesting. But when I found an interesting website, and when you look at these mosaics, though, so they used to be on the floor of this church, and at some point, we're told in 1700s, they were placed on the walls, and they survived the bombing, and you can still see these, but they just look so cartoonish. And I've just I'm going to show you 3 of them. And this is, I guess, a scene. The Pope excommunicated the Crusader army, but just the execution of these seems so cartoonish. Here's a portrait of a group of Crusaders. And this one in particular, Constantinople was conquered by the victorious Crusaders. And just the execution of all of this, it just looks so, I keep saying cartoonish, but that's what it looks like. And just knowing, from my perspective anyway, knowing that a lot of what they're saying happened with regards to the destruction of the Hippodrome and the Great Palace of Constantinople and that port, I'm sort of questioning if these are a more recent plant to sort of back up the narrative of the Crusades. And I'm not even sure if they even happened at this point, but my interest really, when I see stuff like this, it reminds me of something I covered in another video called The Defacers, where I was looking and talking about these rock-hewn churches in northeastern Ethiopia, the Geralta Mountains. And within these, in some of these churches, they're just a trek to get to, but when you finally get inside of these churches, some of them are like 30 feet high with cupolas, but they have these cartoonish frescoes. And this is in one of these churches. And just looking at some of these frescoes, they just very, very amateur, very, very cartoonish. And I just can't help wondering, if these are more recent plants, because they're also in much better state of preservation than the actual structures they're found in. So whenever I see things like this, it's just I question it, and again, we're told people with pickaxes and chisels did all this, but I guess I don't quite believe that. But so, yeah, I'm just questioning this whole narrative of the Crusades as well. And I think these are probably a more recent production than what they're saying, but I think they're just put in place to sort of cement that narrative of the Crusades, in my view, which I can't prove, but that's sort of my speculation. So I think that's it for today, but until next time, take care. Bye.
Take me back to Constantinople. No, you can't go back to Constantinople. Been a long time gone. Constantinople, why did Constantinople get the works? That's nobody's business but the Turks.